Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our security series on Category 8 assessments and reviews. My name's Ed Smiley. I'm Security Compliance Manager within SOS and Information Technology Services. And with me for moral and technical support, I have our web app assessment extraordinaire, John Fine. He's going to help me with any technical questions you guys might have when we get into some of the assessment areas. We're going to have a few polls for you to answer here in a little bit, but just like one of our in-person talks, we want this to be free-flowing. Go ahead and type in any questions that you have, and we'll get to them. So just go ahead and fire away when you have them. So data categorization, and that actually leads to our first poll question. Have you heard of 8071, which is our data categorization? Jen's helping me operate the poll since this is actually the first time I've done just an online one. So just a question, have you heard of 8071? Yes, and you've read the policy, or what is 8071? Just to get an idea, with a lot of these security series talks, we start out with just a little introduction around data categorization and minimum security baseline, but as we do more and more of these, we find that people are pretty familiar with that. So just want to make sure that we spend our time in an appropriate way. Okay, so the majority have heard of it, and some have read the policy. Great. So 8071 is our data categorization policy. 80G07 are examples for data categorization. And the thing to keep in mind with those, you want to be sure to take a look at those when you do get a chance, because those actually list some of the examples that we came up through several of the higher level groups we work with here at the university, with ideas of how data, with examples of how data should be categorized. So take a look at those, and if you see a piece of data that maybe that you use on a routine basis that isn't included there, go ahead and let us know. We have, you can just send an email to datacat@psu.edu, and then we can start work on getting those categorized early. We think we have a pretty good subset of examples there, but we're sure we probably have missed things. Since a lot of you have already aware, 3 categories: public, internal control, and restricted. We have started in production with data categorization. We're currently working with Penn State Erie and also Fayette. We do have a few other areas on the roadmap to do over the next several months. We have developed a technical wiki for the data categorization liaisons. It has a lot of good information there. It's a great start for anybody who thinks they might be picked as one of the data categorization liaisons. It goes over outlines of our meetings and has a lot of resources to use as we go forward on this process. And that wiki is actually updated fairly routinely. We do, since we've been going through pilot and working with different units in production, as we identify things that we think will flow across the whole university, rather than making every individual unit reinvent that wheel, we try to pull it together and put it in the wiki and use that as a resource for all the units. So there's a lot of good technical information in there. And then we have datacat.psu.edu, which is our non-technical. It's going to be for a basic user. Previously it was combined, but we separated the two. So if you have any end users or non-technical people who have questions about data categorization, that would be the site to send them to. And our next poll is about minimum security baseline. And let me get that up here. How many of you have heard of 80G02, which is the minimum security baseline? Okay, that's good. A good majority. And it's good to know that we have been beating the streets pretty hard, both on 8071 data categorization and the minimum security baseline. So it is good to see that that's been paying off. So the minimum security baseline is ADGO2, which is now a guideline that is up on Guru. It was formerly known as the Computer Facility Security Policy. I believe it's now called just Computer Security Policy. Some of you might remember the wiki from several years ago that was data classification and security standards. Data classification turned into data categorization, turned into data classification, and the security standards have turned into the minimum security baseline. We have had this reviewed because it is policy and went through all the regular hoops with President's Council and the like, but we also, before we even went that route, had a review by ITLC. We had several sessions with ITLC, answering questions, shoring up some of the language in there because there was some confusion. And we have this, it's actually a wiki space that could be found doing a search for minimum security baseline. I also have a link at the end of the talk that I can share, and these slides can also be available as well. But we did put this inside a wiki space, and hold on one second. So we did put this inside of a wiki space because we know that this is going to change. So as we go on working with units through this, we know that there's probably going to be changes that come into place for the minimum security baseline. We hope to, because we're using a tool called Modulo to track a lot of the minimum security baseline, if we do find that people for a certain control are asking for more compensating controls for a certain item, that'll be good data for us to go back and think about reviewing that control. Maybe we did set the bar a little high, maybe it needs reworded. So we did want to make sure that that was something that could be changed fairly quickly, and that's one of the big reasons why it's on the wiki space and is a guideline. So getting into category 8, we try to have some catchy nicknames for some of our categories, and I deem this category the Get Started Early category. This is one of the few categories that relies on some resources that are usually outside of your unit. When we talk about development assessment, risk assessment, web app assessment, a lot of those items come outside your unit. So a lot of times you're either coming to our office or to risk management or to privacy OGC to request some of these things. Then a lot of times that will add significant time onto your timelines because a lot of times it's outside your control. So this is a category that you want to get these offices, including ours, started as early as possible, because a lot of times, as you'll see for the web app assessment, that we typically do have a waiting list to get some of those done, and we do have some good news on that front that I'll share with you as well. But if there could be one key take home from this when you think about this category, is get us involved early. We love to be even involved too early. We're actually starting to get some traction where units will come to us a little bit even before we need to get involved, and that's great. And we want people, and we'd much rather say, thanks for coming to us, shore up these things and get us involved. So, don't hesitate to reach out, even if you're unsure when you should involve us. So it's again one of the smaller categories, and this is categories 8.1 with the heading Units developing custom applications must have a documented design, development, and test methodology. So this is required for all types of data, whether it's public or internally controlled and restricted. And the two controls here are security review for custom applications at regular intervals during development, and then configuration and change control processes must be documented. So for 8.1.1, security review for custom applications. In the time we've been kind of passing around the minimum security baseline, talking to units, we typically get several questions for this. And one of the first questions we usually get is, what is a security review? And I actually just list two here. There's many things that we do in our office that we can classify as security review, but these are the two that usually get confused. For a security review, you could have a vulnerability assessment, or you could have a web application assessment. And when we think about vulnerability assessment, and this is something that I think a lot of IT professionals have taken advantage of, we do have an enterprise tool, which is Tenable Security Center, which is actually kind of like a dashboarding tool that is a front end to Nessus, which is our vulnerability scanner assessment tool. That's a self-service tool that IT professionals can run themselves. That's something we recently brought up into service to allow units to be able to do vulnerability assessments much quicker. There's no turnaround time. You can launch a scan, find your issues, go to that machine, patch the machine, fix the issues, relaunch a scan without having to send in a request for us to do it, wait in our queues and things like that. So it's been a really successful tool. We've had a lot of uptake, and people have been using this. We've had several units that have taken it further, have started doing some credentialed scans and doing some configuration management scans to see where maybe some of their configurations aren't doing well. So it's an excellent tool, vulnerability scanning tool. The thing to keep in mind that it's traditionally a network vulnerability scanning tool. So when we think about things like application assessment, this probably isn't the first thing that we go to. Over the years, Tenable has gotten better on having some application, and specifically some web application plugins available to find things like cross-site scripting, remote file access, whether there's root or remote shells available. Obviously, vulnerabilities in common web servers, Apache IIS, things like that. But a lot of their testing is pretty generic, kind of knowing, what flaws could already exist in a system and scanning against those. So it doesn't really go that deep. So there definitely is a use for this tool on the application front to perform a quick scan, get some of the low-hanging fruit, but probably not something that you would want to do for your riskiest and your most restricted data. On the other side of that is the web application assessment. This is really a thorough testing of applications using automated and manual tools. John heads up this effort. He uses multiple tools. They change depending on the type of web app we have, the type of if there's a certain type of backend database or a web server, we might use different tools. But the key with this is that we get a lot of results back. So through the use of all these tools, we get a lot of results. We're typically sifting through false positives. One of the things we want to make sure when we do the web application assessment, that when we give you results back, we're not handing you a Webster's dictionary size report of possible things that could be wrong, that could possibly be false positives. So we try to do a good job of going through those results, try to verify as many as we can. A lot of times if we can't, we'll note that in the report just to make sure that you're aware that it's maybe not something that's for sure, that might require more work on your end to verify. So this is really a much more thorough test. It does take a bit longer to do. We do have many closed source tools that we do purchase, and open source tools that we use for the web application front. here in a couple slides, I'll have some good news on that front that'll help you get your web application assessments done a little bit quicker. But right now, typically there is a waiting list for these. Unfortunately, resources here in SOS, are a little bit limited. So we only have a few analysts that can perform these. So this is another one of those points when we talk about getting started early. Be sure to get those requests in early, even if it's early in the development stage. Get those in and make us aware so we can insert those into our pipeline and have them scheduled appropriately. The web application assessment finds a lot more things. Typically, it'll go a bit deeper rather than in something like Apache or IIS. If you have custom written code, it'll submit a lot of queries in order to find flaws. So it'll find things such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, code injection, information disclosure. So it goes a lot deeper into the application than the vulnerability assessment would. And when you're thinking, if you have an application that has internally controlled or restricted data, this is going to be the one you want. Again, we typically get a lot of confusion with web application assessments versus vulnerability assessments, because a lot of times people will come to us the day before thinking that it is a vulnerability assessment when actually it's a web app one. So one of the key indicators that if you do have an application and you are using, you do have internally controlled or restricted data stored there, you'll definitely want this more thorough web application assessment. So the second question is when, and in the control it says during development, and to tell you the truth, we get requests at all levels of development. Like I said, a good thing, we've getting people to get us involved too early. Unfortunately, I think we still run the rate of getting involved a little bit too late. We're probably getting a little better off away from the site launched last week and somebody mentioned we should talk to you. We're getting a little bit better out of that, but still with the waiting list and what's involved, people typically come to us a little bit later than we would like to get this involved. And the big thing about it is, especially with the custom written app, that if we're going to find things that are going to require large amounts of coding changes, with most development environments, there's going to be a set of testing that has to go through to make sure that the functionality still works. So it'll be important to get this done early in the development cycle. We have assessed applications at several points in the development cycle. We have been able to if the app's available and we find certain flaws, we have been able to go back and just rescan for those certain particular flaws and not necessarily have to send it through all the rigors of the full scan. So again, get us involved early. This control requires during development, so we can definitely work with you. If you have a larger app that's in development over a long period of time, we can work with you on getting a cycle of that. The third question we get, and ranges around custom. And when we think of applications, we can think of two kinds: custom and third party. A lot of times with custom applications, we would like to see you make security testing part of the development process. We have worked with other units that have used have been interested in using a tool like Nessus to do some testing because of its self-service capability, to do some testing that their developers can do to get low-hanging fruit. And that's great. But if you do have a large application, it's best to get in touch with us, and we can work with you to get involved, make it a part of your development process. Where we've been seeing a lot more, I don't know if it's a lot more requests, but we've been seeing data going to third parties a little bit more, and every once in a while we see somebody give us a request for a third-party app. And that can either be a third-party app hosted elsewhere or a third-party app hosted here. With a third-party app hosted elsewhere, we usually can't do any assessments against that. We'll get into a little bit when we get into the risk review, depending upon the contract situation with that. Maybe they're required to have a third party. I guess it'd be a fourth party, but a third party to the vendor to do penetration testing or web application assessment. A lot of times, especially for larger applications, vendors will show that their application has been tested, and that would work to satisfy this control. But typically for us, if it's a third party on a non-Penn State IP address, we usually cannot assess it. Mostly because depending upon the hops on the network that we would go to get to this third party, there could be a lot of issues there. So for third party offsite, we typically don't do, and we would ask that you contact the vendor and see if they have some sort of testing accreditation or certification on that. For a third party hosted here, we have tested those in the past, but we've run into a lot of issues where vendors typically do two things to us. First, they either don't, we find issues and they don't want to fix them because we're essentially at the mercy of them because they're the ones who develop the application. So we run into times where we have found issues and the vendor wasn't interested in fixing them, or they didn't think it was high enough on their radar to fix. And that's typically where then we have to work with the unit to find some sort of compensating control if the issue is able to do that, or if it's bad enough, maybe we do some sort of local fix or pick a new vendor. The second side that we typically get is great, you're going to give us free security testing. And so we become intimately involved with the third-party vendor to work with them to get to get their application ship shape, which really isn't our task either. So a lot of times, if you can get that assertion that the application has been tested, we might be better off looking at the surroundings of the application. If it is stored here, how's it being accessed? Is it tied to a database? How's that being secured? Things like that, rather than actually testing the application itself. And the downside to that, obviously, is it'll still typically require some work with the vendor if we do find any problems on that end to get those fixed as well. So we know that a lot of things have been moving to closed source purchase software and to third parties, and we're quickly trying to get a good grasp on that. The main thing is, if you do have any questions on that, contact us. We can definitely work with you to get through that. So, an exciting announcement. I know we've talked about this in some previous talks. Is that we're working towards launching a self-service web application assessment tool. Our hopes is that'll be available late summer 2014, early fall. It's going to be using the Sensic Hailstorm commercial tool, which is a tool that we use here locally. It's probably one of our main tools that we use for web application assessment. It's a world recognized leader in a web application security tool. So it's a great tool. It'll allow developers and sysadmins and IT professionals to be able to perform their own scans. There'll still be some coordination with us to work on some of those, but it'll allow us to be able to see some results. And if we see something that's maybe a sore thumb, we can comment that on as well. But two of the big things is it'll allow for easier insertion into a development cycle. So just like what Security Center did for a lot of sysadmins to get us out of the loop of submitting requests for scans, We hope that the self-service web application tool will do the same, where developers can actively test their applications and be able to find issues, fix them, rescan easily instead of going through our cycle of requests and acknowledgement of those requests and doing them. Another great thing for us, as I mentioned, the team that does these assessments is pretty small. So our hope is that with enough success with the launch of this tool, that we'll be able to just have units run these web application assessments on applications that have smaller risk footprints. Maybe they just have public data. Maybe it's just your front door that people just come to visit that has information that you want them to read. So we can take that out of having to put applications into our queue. We can focus more on the higher risk applications. Use the manpower and the manual brain power that we have for those. Get those focused on our higher risk apps and allow developers and sysadmins work with this tool and have us, give a stamp to a report or something like that comes in. So we're really excited about the launch of this tool, and I know John has been working hard on testing the tool, getting documentation put into place, and getting it ready to go here pretty soon. I think we're going to be piloting with a few areas to get them to test it, get some results back from that. But we're hoping we can launch this tool pretty soon, and I think it'll, just like Security Center, be a great asset to the sysadmin or the IT professional and the web development community to be able to run their own assessments. And then 8.1.2, to change gears a little bit, is configuration and change management. And probably next to how often should we look at our logs, this is probably one of the big controls that we get a lot of questions on. A lot of units struggle with this because a lot of the larger documentation, is based on large enterprises. So there's staffs dedicated to this, and when you bring down one machine, it might affect hundreds or thousands of machines across the whole environment. And when a unit has just a few servers, they struggle with how much time to invest in change management, configuration management. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the ITX project that's currently going on. I had a chat with Matt Socio, who's on the ITX team, to ask him some thoughts around this area. And the ITX project is helping stand up some structure around, among other things, but specific for this talk, configuration and change management. Long term, there'll be an IT service management program available via the newly formed Service Management Office. There's been lots of peer review and workshops for some policy and process documents for configuration and change management through the ITX project. They will be available within the next couple weeks on the Service Management Office website, which I think is not up yet, but is very close. So go ahead and take a look at those. We have so many units that are typically starting at little to no experience with this. And if you are one of those units, one of the best things is to get those documents, take a look at them, see how they work within your environment. I know ITX is doing a great job of collecting input from many people across many aspects of the university. So one of the big things with this is look at them in the scope of how they will work within your unit, and use them as they are, or adopt those to make them work for what you need to do. So these resources, as I said, will hopefully be available in a few weeks. And if you have any questions on that, you can feel free to contact me. And I told Matt that if there's any specific questions about these that come in, that I can get people linked together with the ITX and the SMO to be able to answer any questions that they might have. So moving on to category A2, which is the last category in this, and this is a risk assessment must be conducted for custom or major vendor supplied applications prior to introduction as a production service, and this is available. This is required for all types of data as well, and there's a few different things to think about this. There's many parts to a risk review that cover many different areas. When you think about something our office would do, we would look at it from a security perspective or an information risk perspective. So we would use things, if it would be an application like the web application assessment, if it would be something else, outside of an application, we obviously have intrusion detection logs, and we have other means to look at what's happening around a certain thing to make a somewhat educated guess on the risk that would be undertaken by doing something. On the other hand, risk management looks at it not necessarily from the security side, and typically not even from the IT side, but they look at it from an acceptable risk perspective. Is this something that's going to introduce a large amount of liability to the university? Is it a risk that Penn State can undertake? Is this something that a local unit can accept the risk? Can a department? Can a college? Can a campus? So a lot of times they're involved at looking at the liability and the risk coming back into the university. And then on top of that, those are typically the two main offices when we think about risk reviews from the IT perspective that get involved. But depending upon where this item is in the process, if it's something new coming in, a lot of times we get involved in the pipeline from purchasing. Typically a unit will want to buy something, go to purchasing for that, and then purchasing will loop us in through the process, especially if it's going to have sensitive data involved, whether it be sensitive data used here or hosted elsewhere. So a lot of times purchasing is also involved, and they have specific ways that they procure items and judge risk. Office of General Counsel gets involved at times, specifically if there's a amount of liability that a company might, if we're getting a piece of free software and something could go wrong, and the amount of liability that could be covered is the price of the software, which is nothing. A lot of time, Office of General Counsel will get involved and give guidance to reduce the amount of liability that the university has to take on. And also privacy and compliance, obviously, when we're talking about data here, there's a large aspect for privacy of that data and making sure that data is used as it should be. So a lot of times, particularly when we're dealing with FERPA data, like student data or HIPAA data, protected health information, a lot of times the privacy office will get involved for this. So depending on what it is, it could be a lot of units, and as you can imagine, take a lot of time to coordinate all those pieces. And the one comment I'll have for this is that we're all learning in this process. The system is far from perfect. I would say just within the last year or two, we've formed a really good relationship with risk management and purchasing to get into this process. We're still struggling with too many too many ways to insert into the process. So right now, a lot of how we manage this is like over email via word of mouth, because risk management has a cover sheet that starts theirs. I know purchasing has a cover sheet. For us, it might come in where somebody requests an assessment for it. So we might get involved that way, and then later involve risk management or purchasing or privacy and compliance. Again, sometimes it's the money trail where a lot of times we'll see people demo software, and they'll actually sign a binding contract when they demo a piece of software, and then they'll use it and decide they want to purchase it, and then sometimes we lose some of our negotiation advantage if we've already engaged the the vendor in a contract. So sometimes we get involved from that front as well. So the real takeaway from this: ask early, and don't hesitate. That if you have some confusion about should this go towards a risk review, should SOS be involved, should risk management be involved. I know with working with all those offices, they're all open to questions. If it is an IT related thing, ask our office. We can definitely get you aligned with the right people in risk management or purchasing or OGC, as it has, depending upon what needs to happen. So again, another one of those takeaways of ask early. So just to get some take home, in case you haven't got the trend or the theme, get us involved early in the process. A lot of you known that our group has grown quite a bit in the past 5 years. So we do have more people over here in SOS that can help you, and we're definitely willing to help get you to the right people that can help you get the business done that you need to get done. So reach out, get us involved early. We have no problem saying you're a little bit early for us, but keep us in the pipeline, keep us involved. So we definitely want that. Understand the differences between web application assessment and vulnerability assessment. And again, to summarize, web app typically takes a longer time, more thorough, geared towards application vulnerabilities, whereas vulnerability assessments are short, typically aiming at low-hanging fruit and geared towards network vulnerabilities. There is some change management guidance coming out of the SMO, so stay tuned for that. There is the ITX website that is available. I think it's ittransformation.psu.edu. Don't quote me on that, but it's pretty easy to find, and there should be some links if the SMO site isn't up and ready to go yet. Again, as we said, risk reviews can get complicated. Ask for help when you get started. It's typically a lot easier to get involved early, get the right people to the venue at the start. There's been times where we've been involved, or we haven't been involved till towards the end of a review, and then we typically ask a different set of questions. So a lot of times that takes us a few steps back. So if we can get the right people to the table right at the start, that typically makes the process go a lot smoother. And again, get us involved early. We much rather say not quite yet than say, wow, that's going to take us a couple weeks and you're not going to be happy about that. So we have a question: how early is early? And it's a tough question to answer because it really depends on what your application is. I think applying specifically to this, if you're starting to whiteboard an application, getting us involved not only helps from, even at the whiteboarding stage, helps us from the application part to give you some pointers about the actual web application. But a lot of times that'll rely on back-end software or back-end infrastructure that we can also work with you to be able to make sure that that's in configured in a secure manner. So I would say anytime that you're whiteboarding an application or you're thinking about demoing something that's a third party or something that you're going to use within within the next 6 months to a year, to let us know that. And even from the non-security perspective on that front, because there is so many different tools that do the same thing, a lot of times people have asked us about a tool to do a specific thing, and we've been able to direct them to somebody else who has purchased either the same tool or similar tool, and link those people together to talk about that. So a lot of times it isn't even that you've selected your tool, but you're thinking about it. So me personally, and some other people might disagree with this. Like I said, I much rather write back the email or return the phone call and say, thanks for getting us involved. It's a little early. When you get to this point, then we'll be happy to help. Or let's, if it's a web application assessment and you're still 6 months out from developing it, we can still keep that on our radar, so you can hit the ground running when you get started. And with that, some resources, we can make this talk available, so you don't have to write those down, but just some links to the policies in Guru. I think a lot of people have been through web application assessment, so we have the link to request that. And then risk management has a cover sheet that they use to get risk reviews done, and that's linked here as well. So with that, I'll take any questions that you might have. Okay, I don't see anybody typing, so if there aren't any other questions, thank you for coming to our security series talk. This has been recorded, so it will be available, in case you missed something or if you want to pass it on to somebody else. We'll have the link sent out shortly, and Jen's typing in the information about our next security series talk. All right. Thank you, everybody.